Good afternoon, and welcome to Illinois Learns to Hunt presents Wild Game Appetizers and Lunch Special. So today we're going to go over different game species and talk about some appetizers you can make with them and also some lunch meals you can have. A quick reminder, your microphone and webcams will be disabled, so you can leave those off. If you have any questions, you can put that in the Q&A window. If you want to talk amongst yourselves or with us, you can also use the chat window. And we will be sending out a copy of this PowerPoint and additional handouts. You'll get a link to this YouTube recording, and you'll also be receiving a survey that you can fill out and let us know how we did, and also any other additional information you might want to know about cooking or food handling in the future. We will have time at the end for any Q&A session that you might have. So any questions you may have, we'll have time to answer at the end. Our presenters today are Dan. Dan, would you like to say hi?
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
Hello. And then we also have Adam. Adam, would you like to say hi quick?
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining us today.
And then we also have Curtis. Curtis, I want to say hello.
Happy lunchtime, everybody.
And myself, I'm Jason, and welcome. So we're going to start off by going over the health benefits and environmental benefits of eating wild game. And we're going to talk about that with Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And like Jason mentioned, you know, this lunch special, we're trying to be as kind of not on I'm blanking on words, unorganized, but we want this to be, you know, more kind of laid back and just go over some of our favorite recipes that we like to share. But like Jason mentioned, we like to give a quick discussion about some of the wild game benefits that you're likely to see. And so we put together this quick graphic that just compares typical cuts of meat from wild game versus domestic livestock, and just did a quick overall estimation of the amount of protein, the amount of fat, and then the caloric content between each of these. So you can see in most cases, wild game is a lot more healthier and is also far more nutritious than that traditional meat that you're going to buy at the grocery store from domestic livestock. Another thing we like to point out is that you have the ability to reduce your carbon footprint through hunting and through eating wild game. We know there's been a big shift in modern society the past decade or so about the impacts that a lot of this domestic livestock has on the natural world and on the plant and animal communities that thrive in these areas. And so we did a quick estimation looking at the total yield for an Illinois deer season. And so you can see on average about 144,000 deer are harvested per year during this specific study. And we estimated that to be about 8.5 million pounds of edible venison. So that doesn't take into account the guts, the hide, the bones. This is pure edible meat. And we essentially compared that to the greenhouse emissions that you're likely to get from domestic livestock. And so you can see just by consuming wild game, you're reducing your overall carbon footprint significantly. And so that's another really important benefit of hunting. And you can see just this quick comparison for about 8.5 million pounds of edible beef. That's going to produce about 159,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. Where if we look at that in venison, that's only about 36,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. When we did this modeling, we took into effect how far people typically drive for public land, how far they drive for private land, the manufacturing of some of the goods. And so this is really a robust data set that really shows that through consuming wild game and hunting, you can really have a substantial impact on reducing your carbon footprint. But now we're going to dive straight into some of our favorite recipes. And again, this webinar is designed to just kind of be laid back and share some of our favorite recipes and how we like to prepare wild game. So first, we're going to start off with what most people have a lot of in their freezer, and that's going to be venison. So this one's a little unique. This is venison bacon jalapeno poppers, and we do have some more standardized recipes using just regular jalapeno poppers a little bit later on, but I really like to use venison bacon for this, and there's some really good venison bacon recipes out there on the internet, whether it's through Meat Eater with Steve Ranella or through some of the Hunt Gather cookbooks, which are by Hank Shaw. He has a really good book called Buck Moose that highlights a lot of these kind of bacon recipes. But I have found, venison bacon. If you go to a deer processor and you get your deer processed, venison bacon is pretty often a readily available option, and it's not super expensive. But I really like to use it in addition to just kind of regular breakfast meals. But I also like to throw it in with jalapeno poppers. And the reason we kind of focused on the kind of shareable or appetizer type dishes today is when I'm sharing wild game with people, I like to, especially if it's kind of their first time trying wild game, I like to make it something that they've had before. Very few people are going to turn down a jalapeno popper. And if it's with venison, that's even a little bit better. So it's a pretty standard recipe. You can either do it in the grill or the oven. I personally prefer the grill. It gets a nice char on the bottom of the jalapenos. So the easiest thing you're going to do is just kind of cut those jalapenos in half. You can either do it like a boat, or you can just cut off the top and core it. But that does cause some issues when you try to stuff cream cheese down inside it. So I kind of like to just make them like this with a boat. And it's really good to use toothpicks just to kind of hold everything in place. And a little splash of smoked paprika can really give some nice flavor and some nice color to these jalapeno poppers. And they're, you cook them for about 5 or 10 minutes and they're ready to go. But this again is a really good dish to just try to get people to try their first bite of wild game. Now, this is one of my go-to recipes, Backstrap Ramen. And I know everyone kind of has their own view of ramen. You can either get the very cheap ramen noodles at the grocery store, or you can go to an Asian market and get a little higher end ramen noodles. But I typically go to the Asian market and get, a higher end noodles that's a little spicy and adds a nice punch of flavor. But it's a fairly easy recipe, even if you don't want to use the prepackaged ramen noodles. This recipe here is if you were not using prepackaged ramen noodles, so you're just buying the noodles whole and making it that way. But this is a really good dish that'll clean out your sinuses pretty quickly. It's got a little bit of heat, especially if you want to add in some extra chili powder. Really gives it a nice kick. But one of my favorite ways to make this, and you can decide, some people like eggs in their ramen, some do not. I prefer to drop an egg in there. It helps kind of cream things up a little bit and also takes away a little bit of that heat, but you still get the flavor. And so making ramen is one of those things that's really easy. Obviously, just start with a saucepan over medium heat and saute your garlic, your onions, red pepper flakes, and a little bit of ginger. You can either, I prefer to use, real ginger, natural ginger, but you can, or not real or natural, but fresh ginger, I guess I should say for a better term. But you'll just kind of slowly start to bring these things to a nice saute, get some nice color in the onions so they're a little bit translucent. Go ahead and add your broth, water, fish sauce. If you're not a big fan of fish sauce, it really elevates ramen up to in my opinion, to a whole new level. It gives that ramen what I kind of call ramen flavor. It's a very common sauce that's used in a lot of Asian cuisine, and this is a really good method for that. And now when you're going to top it with venison, you can either use backstrap or really any cut of steak. But you have a couple different options to cook it. You can either grill that steak and get it to your level of doneness that you want. But another option is you can go ahead and pre-slice it and just drop those chunks of venison steak into your pot or into your pan as it's cooking, and that'll slowly bring that up to temperature and cook it that way. So you can either do it that way, or you can just kind of throw it on a grill, get a nice sear, and get it to your level of doneness, and then go ahead and slice it up and put that on top of your ramen once that meat's cooked. But that's the ramen backstrap and steak ramen is a really good dish for those cold days when maybe you're not necessarily feeling chilly, but you want to try something a little bit different. Ramen is a great option for that, and it's one of my favorite ways to use wild game, is experimenting with different cultural cuisines, and I have found deer ramen to be a great recipe. Now we'll kind of shift things a little bit. We talked about a little bit of Asian cuisine, a little bit of kind of Southern American cuisine with the jalapeno poppers. But now we're going to dive into Mexican cuisine. And this is, if I'm having I like to frequently have what I call kind of beast feast. It's where I'll invite some people over and we'll all kind of cook our own wild game dishes and just kind of share things. One of my favorite things to do, particularly with ground venison, is to make some type of tostada or a taco bar or a nacho bar. That way people can kind of customize it themselves, and it's a really great option, again, to get people to try venison who may never have before. So this is a fairly easy recipe. You can either bake or fry your own corn tortillas to make the tostada shell, or you can buy the store-bought. I typically buy the store-bought just because it's a lot easier and a lot quicker. But just go ahead and brown your ground venison in a skillet over medium heat. Now you will want to add a little bit of oil. As we kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, when we looked at the nutritional quality between domestic livestock and wild game is a very lean meat, so there's not a lot of fat in there. So I typically, if I'm browning some venison, now some people, I'll go ahead and say a caveat. Some people, when you get your deer ground up at a processor, they may add pork fat. They're going to ask you if you want to add pork fat. So if you have pork fat added to your beef, that's going to be enough fat in there to go ahead and get that nice and brown. But I typically will add, a little bit of bacon grease, or maybe a teaspoon of butter, just to get some oil in that pan, to add some fat to that very lean venison. But after you get it nice and brown, go ahead and drain off the grease and remove from heat. And at that point, I like to add the onion and the taco seasoning, and you can make your own taco seasoning, or you can buy the prepackaged taco packets that they sell at every grocery store, whether it's Taco Bell or one of these other taco seasonings. But I typically like to make my own taco seasoning. And now we didn't put a specific recipe in here, but if you just kind of Google around taco seasoning, you'll find some very authentic and very, very good taco seasoning that you can put together with the majority of things that you likely already have in your kitchen. So after that, you get that meat seasoned, you add some onions. When I'm basically putting together a tostada or taco bar, you can either go ahead and do this up front, or you can just have everything laid out, but you essentially want to lay kind of a nice thin layer of refried beans. And some people will go ahead and warm the beans with a little bit of sour cream just to add some creaminess to those beans. I personally don't do that. I just kind of add the sour cream right on top of the beans, but that's an option. So you're just going to start, putting your beans and then put all your toppings together. And this is going to be a big hit for everybody, I promise. Now, this is one of those recipes that's kind of what I like to describe as set it and forget it. It's a really good recipe that works well if you have projects around the house and you can only, you need 3 or 4 hours or so to go do something. This is the perfect recipe. And again, this is a good one that if you're having, a bunch of people over, you can start it in the morning and just kind of let it sit in the crock pot all day. That way, when everyone gets there, it's kind of ready to go. But this is a fairly easy recipe. You're just going to start with a venison roast. I prefer to start with one of the rump roasts, and I will go ahead and clean up a lot of the silver skin. If you've looked at a deer roast, very often there's going to be this kind of sinuous tissue that lays over top of the muscle. I personally like to go ahead and remove that for this recipe. Not everybody does. It can add a level of gaminess if it doesn't render out completely. So I try to go ahead and get all that cleaned out as much as possible. But then I'm just going to mix all my ingredients like ketchup, sugar. You can either use white sugar or brown sugar, but I found the brown sugar adds a little bit more flavor and caramelizes really nicely in a crock pot and makes it more of kind of a barbecue sauce. So I do recommend using brown sugar. A little bit of ground mustard, lemon juice, soy sauce, and liquid smoke is one of those things that some people aren't a fan of. Some people think it has a total artificial flavor. But if you do like liquid smoke and you're willing to use it, it does add a nice smoky flavor to your barbecue sauce that you're essentially making. Celery salt, Worcestershire sauce, and a little bit of onion powder, and that's about all you need for this recipe. So you'll go ahead and take that roast. Now, some people will go ahead and pan sear that roast. I necessarily don't take that step. I just kind of throw it straight in the crock pot. So I'll put all my ingredients for the sauce in the crock pot. Give it a nice mix up, put a giant roast in there. And you can do this with about a 3 or 4 pound roast. Whatever your crock pot will fit will probably cook, with the same time frame. Now, you probably will need to up your barbecue sauce a little bit. You may need to, double everything. But you'll go ahead and let that cook on low for about 4 hours. At that point, I like to pull the meat out and cut it into a little bit smaller chunks just to allow it to cook even better. And then I'll keep cooking it on low for about 3 hours. So this is a very low and slow recipe. And once it gets to that point, you'll start to realize that it's very fork tender. And at that point, that's when I'm going to pull it completely out of the crock pot, shred it with forks. You may need to let it rest for a few minutes, but then shred it with forks and put it all back in the crock pot with that sauce and just kind of let it simmer until you're ready to serve. And it's really good with a little bit of cheese on a toasted bun. This is one of my go-to venison recipes. It's just one of those that's tried and true and always works well. It is extremely easy to do as well. Now, this is a recipe that we kind of stole from somebody I mentioned a little bit ago, Hank Shaw. You can find this full recipe on his website. We didn't want to steal the entire recipe because we do want to give him credit. So if you're really interested in pastrami, go check out this link at the bottom. And again, when we send out this PowerPoint, the email, either later today or early tomorrow, we'll go ahead and provide this link so you can just quickly, copy and paste it in your browser and find it. But pastrami is one of those that I guess I'll take a step back. I'm a huge fan of kind of cured and smoked wild game, particularly, pastrami is by far one of my favorite ways to make venison in terms of a sandwich. And so what you're essentially doing is you're going to cure it and then you're going to smoke it. And it gets this beautiful kind of mahogany color. It's excellent on sandwiches. It's excellent if you just want to, slice it up and put it on a sharp kind of a meat and cheese board or something like that. But this is a really good tried and true recipe. And if you're interested in smoking, this is a great way to use up some of your venison and get, different meals out of it. Because that's what I'm all about with my wild game is how can I get the most meals and the most unique meals out of this harvest. And this is a great way to prolong that meal, to the point where I'll smoke a pastrami. I'll typically do 2 or 3 at a time. You can see here at the bottom, I have 4 going. I'll freeze 3 of them, slice one of them up immediately, and that just acts as deli meat essentially for a week or 2 of lunches. And so it's a great way to get a little bit more yield out of your venison and allow that venison to stretch a little bit further. And this is also a great recipe if you're a waterfowl hunter. I've done this with goose breast in the past, and it is just as good, if not better, than doing venison pastrami. So you can also do this with Canada goose. Now we've got an Irish dish that I think Curtis is going to tell us about.
Yeah, so given the day, happy St. Patty's Day, everybody. A little Irish stew, real hearty stew with a lot of root vegetables, potatoes. This is a great way to use venison, and especially like we just had here a couple days ago. We were in the Midwestern fall spring, and then second or third winter came back, and it kind of got me thinking, man, be a good time for a chili or a stew or something like that. This is a great one to put in there on a cold day. So, and again, you can use pretty much any wild game, but venison's generally what we've got the most of around here. And this is one you could use with ground venison, or if you've got a stew meat or a roast that you can chunk up, that works too. But you want to start by browning if you are using hamburgers or chunks of meat. If you brown it first in a hot oven, you'll get a better consistency to the meat rather than if you just kind of cook it all together, because then the meat steams and it doesn't really get kind of a crispy edge with a juicy middle. So I like to brown it first, and go ahead and throw in whatever veggies you're using at that time too to get the cooking process started there. And then you'll go ahead and start with your broth. And if you have venison broth, which you can make by using the long bones, that's excellent. If you don't, beef broth works just fine too. And then throw in a can or 2 of your favorite Irish stout beer to give it that real depth of flavor and really make sure you're eating an Irish stew. Tomato paste for color, bay leaves, of course. Make sure you fish those out when you're done. They don't chew very well, so unless you like eating chunks of shoe leather, you'll want to fish those things out. Sugar, thyme, and Worcestershire sauce are good flavorings to add in there to your own taste. And then you can finish that off with a little bit of parsley or cilantro if you're so inclined. I'm a huge fan of cilantro, but the one caveat you got to throw out there, cilantro is one of those polarizing herbs. For me, it's my favorite. I'd put it on practically everything if I was able to, but about 15 to 20% of the population dislikes it with a passion. It's very unfortunate for them. I feel sorry for them every day of my life, but they think cilantro tastes like soap or dirt. So if you are going to add cilantro, definitely recommend, chopping it up and putting it in a bowl and letting people add it themselves, because otherwise somebody's gonna think your dish tastes like soap. All right, and then for a real crowd pleaser, everybody likes cheesy dishes, real good appetizer if you're going to watch a game. Great thing to put out, and you'll definitely be taking home an empty pan every time. But and this is real easy to do. Your basic beer cheese dip, but just with the inclusion of wild game. And here use venison, but again, you could use practically anything in your freezer for this. And I've even done this with some mountain lion burger before, and it turned out fantastic. But yeah, the basic things are you're going to start by browning your venison, like always, to give it a little bit better consistency there. And you're going to want to brown that beforehand. And then once you're putting it all together, really all you're doing is melting the cheese. So you could make this in a crock pot, you could make it in a cast iron pan, anything like that. And super flexible. You can use whatever kinds of cheese that you want. Any kind of good melting cheese is fine. You could substitute mozzarella for something a little bit more mild, but I like a pretty bold cheese, so I go with like a cheddar, even a sharp cheddar, and then Gouda. Those two go really well together, and then the cream cheese kind of brings it down a little bit. Again, throw in your Irish dark beer to meld in with the cheese and give it depth of flavor there. And then you can thin it out if needed with whole milk. So the cream cheese, once it cooks down, might make it creamy enough for you, but since generally this is served as a dip, so you're gonna want it to be pretty soft, you might have to throw in some milk to thin it down so it's easy to dip. And again, just finish it with fresh herbs and spices. Paprika is good to give it a good smoky flavor. And again, Worcestershire sauce and ground mustard, or even a spicy brown mustard mixed in there. Great ways to add a little bit of flavor. And this is a good way for, again, like Dan said, with the poppers, to get people who maybe might be hesitant to try a lot of wild game. But then you immerse it in cheese and allow somebody to dip a cracker or a baguette into there, and all of a sudden it seems not so scary. And yeah, a real crowd pleaser, a real artery clogger, not one you're going to want to eat every day, but if you make it a couple times a year for the Super Bowl or a big game or a St. Patty's Day party, I think you're gonna be having a good time. Now we'll get into some rabbit recipes. If anybody's got any rabbits left in their freezer. So first off, and this is with all small game, just talk a little bit about your basic prep. So a lot of times once we get done hunting, tired in the field, going to clean our critters and freeze them, but we may not have done the best job getting that completely ready for the pan. So I always thaw it out and put it on a cutting board and go over it real good, make sure I've got it cleaned up really well, cut off any bits of anything that I missed, and then also butcher it into pieces that are going to fit into our pan. And then the basics. Now, if I want to just basically cook up a bunch of rabbits or squirrels so that they're cooked and then use them in a number of different recipes, this is kind of my go-to. Salt and pepper both sides. add in whatever spices I want. I generally keep it pretty mild at this step because, like I said, I like to pull the meat off and have this sort of tray of pre-cooked meat that I can make a lot of different recipes with. And then dredge it in flour. And then in the next slide, we're going to start to see when the magic happens. Put a little bit of oil or some kind of fat in the bottom of your cast iron pan on high heat and brown it. So just like when we were browning the venison earlier, same thing with rabbit or squirrel. Try to get it browned up on all sides. And then once you've got that good sort of crisp brown edges on all sides, you can pour in some broth. And in this next slide, I have done just that, and I did not have any rabbit or pheasant broth on hand, so I used chicken broth. That's okay, but again, you can make your own broth, and with birds like pheasants, if you just save the feet and the carcasses, throw all them together with some root vegetables and stuff in a big stock pot and make your own broth and save it and use it throughout the year, that's going to even add another little layer of appeal to your dish. But anyway, I use chicken broth, little cheater method, but it works real well too. And as long as you keep that rabbit or squirrel wet, so make sure you're checking on it, you can cook it basically as long as you want to. Don't let your pan go dry, but for animals the size of rabbits and squirrels, generally they're going to be done in just about 30 minutes to 45 minutes. You want them to get 165, which is important, especially with rabbits. But yeah, that's generally done in less than an hour. But the longer you let them go in there, just the more tender they're going to be. And as long as you keep that broth in there and keep it covered, they're going to stay super moist, super tender, and you can let it go 2 hours or more and it'll just be falling off the bone. Really good. And so once you get it done, then you can start to jump into all sorts of different kinds of recipes. And go on to the next slide here. And here's one I really like. So if you've got picky eaters, maybe kids that it's tough to find something that they want to eat. Well, I've got all this pre-cooked, ready rabbit that's shredded in my fridge. I can pull out some pre-made ingredients, and I really like kimchi because I'm a big cabbage fan, and it's already got some flavors, some spice built in there. But if you're not a kimchi fan, just using regular cabbage cut up works too. Some bell or sweet peppers. And if you want some heat, get a jalapeno or a serrano, cut it up, put it in there too. Get whatever spices you want, and just some store-bought tortillas. And we'll go on to this next slide here, and you can actually use these store-bought tortillas to make it look like you spent all day making your own dough to make these little dough packets. But you'll know the secret that somebody else did the hard work for you. But put all your fillings, your rabbits, your peppers, and any spices you want right inside that tortilla. And then using a fork, you can kind of adhere, make a bond between the edges, trim it up so that it's a neat little dough pocket around your filling, and then just simply throw it in some hot oil and the magic happens. So our rabbit and squirrel's already cooked, so we're not really trying to cook anything. All we're doing is getting the dough nice and crispy brown. So these can be done once you have them made in just a couple minutes. And yeah, I don't know too many picky eaters that are going to turn down a crispy fried dough filled with rabbits and some peppers and veggies. So really good crowd pleaser, especially for picky eaters, and really stretches out your, maybe you've only got one rabbit and one squirrel, and how does everybody get a chance to try it? Well, doing something like this is a good way to really stretch it out and let everybody get a taste in a way that doesn't scare them. It looks like something that they're very familiar with.
Now we'll move into some of my favorite upland bird recipes. And a lot of these recipes, you can also substitute squirrel or rabbit. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through these next few. But my first favorite is one that I pretty much make. I think I've made it the past 7 New Year's Eve, other than last year, because we didn't go out. But this is one of those that just does really well with, again, people who may not necessarily have a taste for wild game yet. But I pretty much every New Year's I've made squirrel buffalo chicken dip, and we tell everybody it's squirrel, but I promise it's a great way to get people to eat squirrel for the first time. And then, as their palate starts to refine and they become more open to the idea of eating squirrels, because for a lot of people, it's a tree rat, it's a rodent, it's kind of a gross animal. So just getting them the introduction at this stage, and then you can try some of the other dishes a little bit later on. But this is a real easy one that you can make either in the oven, on the grill. I have seen some people that will even put it in the smoker for about 20 to 25 minutes just to get a nice smoky flavor on the cheese. But I typically prefer to either do it in the oven, or if it's going to be like a long night and you just want people to be able to keep coming back to it, that's when I'll kind of do it in the crock pot. But you're going to start with basically 2 cups of shredded meat. So you can use pheasant, squirrel, rabbit. You will want this meat to be cooked already. So there's obviously several different ways you could go about that. But it's basically very simple. It's cream cheese, hot sauce. I personally use Frank's Red Hot just because it's cheap and easy and it works well. And then ranch dressing or blue cheese dressing, whichever is your favorite. And then if you want to garnish it on top with a little extra cheese or a little bit of sliced up green onion just for a little bit of color and a little extra flavor, that can really kind of jazz it up. But essentially, you're just going to start with your cooked meat. Get that all cooking. Go ahead and shred it into nice fine pieces, and then you'll just mix all the ingredients together. And you can either bake it again till it's nice and golden brown on top, or you can do it in a crock pot. Now, if I'm doing it in the oven, I'll do it for about 15 minutes at kind of 350 degrees until it starts to get real nice and warm all the way throughout. And then I typically will take off the aluminum foil, turn my oven on to broil, and get a nice broil going in the oven. And it's only going to take about a minute for that cheese to get nice and crispy on top and get a real nice brown color. And at that stage, it's pretty much done. I personally like to serve it with chips, crackers, baguettes, or even vegetable sticks is a great option. But now these next few slides, I'm going to kind of detail one of my favorite processes for getting pheasants ready to be consumed. Obviously, we all understand about marinating, and some of us may have heard of the term brine and brining. And brining essentially is a chemical process that's fairly simple. So protein or meat already contains some level of salt water. And as we know, through some basic chemistry, if you have a high salt content versus a low salt content, it's going to want to equalize. And so the theory and the process behind this is you soak your meat in salt water that is more salty than the meat itself, and that's going to pull moisture and pull more salt and other flavors into that meat as it sits there and brines in the fridge. So this is again a fairly easy process, and it's very up to you, essentially, whatever herbs and spices you want to use. The big thing to keep in mind is you're going to want cold water, and salt and sugar are kind of the big components of a brine. But with this recipe, I typically will use 1.5 quarts of water, 4 garlic cloves, some kosher salt. Cracked peppercorns work really well. And when I'm talking about garlic cloves, a lot of times I'll go ahead and roast those garlic cloves ahead of time, get them nice and browned, and then kind of dice them up and throw in the bag. Again, that just adds a nice level of flavor to that brine. And then just add in your favorite spices. So I typically like to use thyme. That adds a nice kind of aromatic quality to the brine as well as the meat. A little bit of allspice, and then 1 bay leaf, just again to add a little bit more herb flavor into that brine. And so you're going to basically bring all of this water brine mixture up to a boil, and you're going to let it simmer for about 15 to 20 minutes. And that's going to really start to open up the herbs like the thyme and the bay, and then some of the cracked peppercorns and the garlic in there. It's going to start to draw all those flavors out, and they'll be kind of embedded in the water. You want this mixture to completely cool, because again, we're not cooking the meat at this time. We're just basically brining it. So we want that to be completely cool. So oftentimes I'll start the brine in the morning, and then sometime in the afternoon, that's when it'll kind of all be cooled off and ready to go. Again, depending on temperature and how high you get it to boil. But you want it to be completely cool or warm temperature. At that point, you're going to place your raw pheasant in a Ziploc bag, and you're going to fill it up with this cooled brine. Go ahead and squeeze out as much of the air from that bag as you can and put it in the refrigerator. Typically, I like to do about 24 hours. That seems to be a good time frame for me. And every couple hours, every time you go back to the fridge to get a drink or get some food out, just go ahead and flip that bag. And that's just going to allow different parts of the meat to come in contact with that brining solution to make sure everything kind of gets equally drawn in to the meat. And at that point, I'm going to, after that time's elapsed and I'm ready to cook it, I'll go ahead and drain that mixture. And it's very important to lightly rinse the meat. Remember, we're using a very salty solution here, and a lot of that salt is already going to be drawn into the meat itself. And so if you leave that salt layer on the outside, it's going to be extremely salty and oftentimes unpalatable. So go ahead and rinse off that with nice cool water as much as possible, just to get all that excess brine off. And then you can cook it, a multitude of different ways. But what the brine really does is, again, it's going to draw a lot of those flavors into the meat, but it also draws a lot of excess moisture. And that moisture is going to retain in that meat as you cook it. And so not only are you going to get a better tasting protein, but you're also going to get a lot moister protein, which with pheasant is very important, because pheasant has kind of a tendency to over dry and overcook itself, especially if you're just grilling it, like you can kind of see here in this picture. So the brine really helps hold in that moisture so that you get that nice juicy cut of meat when it's all finished. But when you're preparing pheasant this way, typically I'm not just grilling pheasant and kind of serving it like you see here in this picture. Usually I'm preparing the pheasant this way for another dish, and so this is a great way to get that nice shredded pheasant that we talked about using it in some of the other examples before. But this is one of my favorite ways to make pheasant tacos, pheasant nachos, any kind of Mexican dish, or anything that just uses pulled pheasant. But it also is a great way to just serve like this. Some of us have probably heard of the Dixie Stampede in Branson, Missouri. It's very common for them to have the Cornish game hens, and they serve them whole, and it's kind of this whole barbaric type experience that you feel very rustic, and so that appeals to somebody. So if I'm going to cook a pheasant whole that way, and I want it nice and grilled and to hold moisture, brining is the perfect way to do that. But my favorite recipe for brined pheasant, especially if I'm kind of making a shareable type dish, is going to be pheasant nachos. And I know this is pretty simple stuff, but this is always a crowd pleaser. Always goes really well with kids, with older people, with middle-aged, Gen Zers, or with everybody. Everybody likes nachos. It's just one of those really good crowd pleasers. So basically, I like to build my nachos in kind of a layer format. So I'm going to spread out half the chips on my baking sheet or on a disposable foil pan, and I'll start putting about half the toppings on top. Then I'll go ahead and lay another bed of chips down on top of those and restack it that way. That way you get good coverage on all the chips, instead of, if you just pile everything on top, then when you get to the bottom, you'll have a lot of chips that really don't have much flavor and much to do. But what I have found that goes really well with this pheasant brining solution is when you're putting it in nachos or other Mexican type cuisines, is to get some nice lime zest or lime juice. I personally use both. I'll put a little bit of zest lime inside of the sour cream and just kind of mix that up, and that's going to go ahead and flavor that sour cream a little bit and add that nice lime kind of tanginess to it. But then once I get the full nachos done and they're ready to serve, I'll squeeze a lime over top of it and just let some of that lime juice kind of seep through the nachos. And again, that's just going to add a nice acid to the dish that's going to cancel out some of the sweetness, and it's going to give a nice level of tartness. And I promise it's a really good crowd pleaser. Now, this is my all-time favorite pheasant recipe. If I have pheasant in the freezer and I don't really have a dish in mind to make, this is what I'm going to make 9 times out of, probably 9.5 times out of 10. It's just one of those that goes really well. You can do it a few different ways. I prefer to go ahead and brine the pheasant ahead of time and cook it either in the oven or in the grill just till it gets to a level of doneness that I'm happy with. And at that point, I'll go ahead and use 2 forks to again, shred that into kind of reasonable chunks of meat for a white chili, so to speak. But this one's fairly simple. You can put a medium onion in. I like to use white or Vidalia onion, adds a nice level of flavor. Garlic, you can either use garlic powder, garlic salt. I would probably stay away from garlic salt. You don't want this dish to be too salty because that meat, remember, is already going to have a fairly substantial amount of salt that's being pulled from that brine solution. So I wouldn't recommend using garlic salt. I'd stick with garlic powder or fresh garlic. You will need some northern beans. I use about two 15-ounce cans and 1 can of chicken broth. Again, if you go back to the slide, Jason, really quick, that shows the pheasant being grilled, one of my favorite reasons for why I grill pheasant like this and keep the carcass whole with the legs and the wings still attached is so that after I shred that meat, like Curtis mentioned, I can save that carcass and go ahead and make a really nice pheasant stock out of it. And so if you're interested in that process, Hank Shaw has a really good chapter in his book on it. I think that book is Pheasant, Quail, and Cottontail. Curtis, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. Steve Rennell also has a few really good pheasant or upland bird stock recipes in their books as well. But you can either use, your pre-made pheasant stock here, or you can just go kind of the simpler route and use the canned chicken broth. Green chilies are really important for this recipe. They kind of make, this chili what it is. So I typically will use about 2 of the 4-ounce cans. That adds kind of a nice level of heat, but not too much at the same time. Salt, cumin, oregano, black pepper, and cayenne pepper. And the cayenne pepper is where you can experiment if you don't like spicy food. Maybe use a 1/4 teaspoon or so of cayenne pepper. If you're somebody who likes a lot of spice in your chili, then maybe go ahead and add a little bit more. But I will say if you add a little bit more, do it sparingly because it really elevates it quick. And you can see in this specific example, I like to serve it with sour cream. Again, if you make it really hot, that just takes a little bit of the heat away and makes it into a really nice dish. But this is one of my all-time favorite ways to serve pheasant. Everybody I've cooked it for has seemed to like it in the past, and it's a really tried and true recipe that's worth trying.
And yeah, now we're going to be covering our second jalapeno popper recipe, some dove poppers. I was lucky enough to find a bag of frozen dove breasts tucked away in the freezer a couple days ago that we got last September and decided to turn them into some tasty poppers. So field to fork right there. So step 1, of course, you're going to want to field dress your doves. This was already done, of course, after we got back from the hunt. So I basically just had to defrost the breasts and then, of course, clean them up again, make sure I had all the feathers and BBs out of the breasts. And just before we get into making dove poppers, I just wanted to give a quick note. If you wanted to fry dove breasts, I leave them whole like this and throw them right in to some breading. We usually use Andy's fish fry breading. You can generally find that in about every store. They have pretty big bags in Walmart, I believe. But this is the way I like to keep them when I want to fry them, just because dove breasts are really small and you do lose a little bit of meat if you try to carve it off the breastbone. This way, when you fry them and they cook nicely inside, you can basically just peel off both sides of the breast right off the bone after they're fried. So you don't waste any meat and you just have 2 nice little fried medallions. But if you do want to make poppers, you're going to have to carve them off the breastbone. So that's what it looks like there. Again, make sure you trim off any of the shot meat, or if there's any, shot pellets left in them, make sure to pick those out and cut off any other, ugly excess off the meat there. If there's anything you want to have gone, pretty simple. And I threw these in a bowl with a little bit of a marinade for a little bit since I had some time prior to making them. I just used a little bit of olive oil to cover them nicely. Seasoned salt, black pepper, and a little bit of garlic powder. So just pretty simple, but of course you can make this to your taste if you want them spicy, if you want, any other flavors in there, throw those in. Pretty simple, self-explanatory there. And then of course we had some jalapenos. So cut those in half, and I usually go the boat method as well, as Dan was mentioning earlier, as you know, it is a little difficult to try and stuff a whole jalapeno, especially when they're funky shaped like that. So I just cut them in half, clean the veins out really nice, and the seeds. Of course, that's where all the heat is. So if you don't like too much spice, you can even cut these in half and have, you know, smaller chunks of jalapeno. I like it pretty spicy, so I just used the whole half, which made it pretty darn good. But yeah, make sure to clean the veins and seeds out. Next, you're gonna want to get some bacon. So I cut the strips in half, got some toothpicks, and of course I forgot to put the cream cheese in the picture, but don't forget your cream cheese. If you want to mix it up a little bit, use some veggie or chive cream cheese. That's really good. We just went with the regular plain brick. And you're going to want to put them together. After that, you've got your boat of jalapeno, little slice of cream cheese, dove breast in the middle, and then of course wrapped in bacon with a skewer in the middle to hold it all together. I also prefer to throw these on the grill. I like the char, as Dan was explaining earlier as well. I made these on a day that was really bad weather, so we threw them in the oven. So I got an oven safe rack so it can drip down onto the baking sheet, which makes them a little crispier, but pretty simple at 350. Usually it'll be around 15 minutes, give or take, on how fast your oven cooks. But I basically just like to keep an eye out for the bacon. The dove itself cooks very, very quick, and you don't want that overdone because they do turn pretty tough. So I basically just keep an eye out on the bacon, get it to how I like it, and after that, pull them out, give them a rest, and they're ready to eat. And with that, I believe Dan is going to go over the next goose recipe.
Yeah, waterfowl is one of those wild dishes that if it's cooked well, it is hard to beat. You know, there's always been this kind of stigma around waterfowl. You know, you always hear the joke, oh, they go really in depth into this recipe. You know, brine it, soak it in salt, put all these different spices on it, put it on a piece of cardboard, grill it for an hour, pull it out, throw the duck away, and eat the cardboard. But I'm here to tell you, if you cook waterfowl well and you cook it the way it should be cooked, it's I think it's the best wild game, especially a really nice mallard. It pairs really nice with any kind of fruity dish. So when I'm thinking about waterfowl, that's the first thing that comes to my mind is a very sweet dish that has some nice fruity flavors that really augment that waterfowl. If you try to cover it up with too much salt flavor, it'll get real tough on you really quickly, and so you want to cook it, you know, nice low and slow, and don't overcook it. So one of my favorite ways to prepare mallard, or now I should clear up a few things, and if you're not a duck hunter, this might sound a little bit intimidating at first, but there's basically two groups of ducks. There's the dabbling ducks and there's the diving ducks. And the diving ducks are very oftentimes going to have a different flavor profile of the meat than the dabbling ducks will. The dabbling ducks are going to feed on a lot of shallow water vegetation as well as agriculture fields and other grain products, where a lot of your diving ducks are going to be diving deep into the water. They're going to be looking for invertebrates in the kind of muddy silt of the body of water that they're in. A lot of times they'll ingest fish and eat fish, but a lot of times they're just kind of eating those deep water plants. And oftentimes, again, that's going to change the flavor profile. So I would not do this particular dish with a diving duck. I'm going to save it for some of the more flavorful dabblers, and mallard is perfect for that. And with this recipe, you can do it with as many mallards as you want, but again, it's a really nice way to get a lot of people to taste mallard and have it taste good. It's a very, very, very easy process. What I like to do is I'm going to take, at this point, the cavity is whole, so the entire carcass is whole. I haven't, breasted it out. This is an entire duck carcass. I'm going to get a real nice salt layer on the inside of the carcass as well as on the outside, and then I'm going to use maple syrup, and that maple syrup is going to add that sweetness that I kind of mentioned that goes really well with waterfowl. And so you're just going to smoke it. I typically try to stay between 200 and 220. I have an old smoker that doesn't really retain its temperature as well as it probably should. So my temperature range is a little bit different, but if you can keep yours at 220, I think you'll be in good shape and happy with the results. But I recommend using an apple wood. I know some people will try to use a pecan or maybe an oak or hickory. I find those to be a little bit too strong for waterfowl. Again, waterfowl is a very delicate flavor, and I want to use a nice delicate wood like apple wood that's going to, again, get some of that fruity aromatic smoke layer that we're looking for. So I like to use apple wood, and I'm going to smoke it for about 4 hours until it's at a good place. And now with this, let it sit for about 45 minutes to an hour. And I know it's going to be very tempting because you're going to smell that smoke flavor, and you're going to smell that fruit flavor coming off it and that maple syrup. But don't start immediately carving into the meat, because once you do that, you kind of break the barrier of moisture, and that's going to allow a lot of that moisture to start seeping out of the meat. So you want to let it cool for about 45 minutes to an hour until it's about room temperature, and that's when I'm going to go ahead and slice it up. And I prefer to serve it with a fruit-based cheese, so you can get those at any of your favorite markets. But you can also make a fruit jelly, or you can even buy kind of a fruit jelly or a fruit salsa that'll pair really nice with it. I found cranberries pair extremely well with Mallard, and so that's typically what I go for, is like a cranberry salsa or maybe a cranberry jam. And then I'll again serve it with some fruit-based cheese and maybe some fruit and crackers, and it's just a great way to just have a nice cheese and meat dish that people can just kind of come snack on as they go. And I promise you'll get a lot of compliments on this dish. But the important thing when you're smoking it is I'm going to baste it about every 45 minutes with more maple syrup on the outside. And again, that's just going to give that nice sweetness to the meat that really adds a lot to the flavor. Now, this one may not, be considered a shareable dish, but I think it's worth highlighting. This is one of the easiest ways I've found to prepare goose. That's not intimidating. It doesn't have a ton of unique flavors. It's something most people are familiar with, is stir fry. I actually like to do a lot of snow geese with this. Canada geese I tend to prefer for pastrami or some other dishes, but snow goose, which you don't get as much of a yield on, that's when I like these type of recipes. So snow goose, Ross's goose, the blue morph of the snow geese, these are all great for this recipe, as well as any of kind of the dark meat ducks. So this is where some of those diving ducks I'll also use here as well. Because again, this just that strong flavor of stir fry and the soy sauce and Worcestershire and vinegar is going to help cut out some of that quote unquote fishiness that some might be able to taste with the diving ducks or some of these snow geese. But I like to personally use a wok. I know not everyone has a wok, so you can just use a big skillet. But it's pretty easy. Just go ahead and cut your goose breasts into nice thin strips. And in a small bowl, once you have those cut up, go ahead and combine the cornstarch, the sugar, soy sauce, vinegar, and pepper. And I'm going to pour about half of that mixture into a Ziploc bag and the other half into a Tupperware or something, just to retain it. I don't want to waste that other stuff. And then I'm going to basically marinate the goose strips inside of this bag and refrigerate for about 1 to 2 hours. I like to go a little bit further with my marinade, so if you can get it to the 2 hour mark, you're in good shape. But after that, I'm going to go ahead and drain the goose strips and discard the marinade that was in that bag with them. And then I'm going to start stir frying. So I'm going to use peanut oil or something a very high temperature oil, because I like to get my pan just ripping hot when I'm doing stir fry. So I'm going to start stir frying the goose and the vegetables and just get that really nice and hot until that meat looks cooked and is no longer pink. And then you're pretty much ready. I'm going to go ahead and at that point stir in my reserved marinade that I had set aside from when I first made it. I'm going to go ahead and dump that in and let that simmer for, it says 1 to 2 minutes here, but I like to let it simmer a little bit longer. I found that kind of thickens it up a little bit. You may need to add a little bit of flour. Or even a little bit more cornstarch if you want that sauce to thicken up a little bit and thicken up nicely. But I'm just going to keep simmering until that sauce gets really nice and thick and just kind of coats everything in this kind of beautiful glaze. And it's really good served on top of rice, and I promise it'll be a crowd favorite. And this quick fun story. This picture was actually taken at one of our Learn to Hunt workshops. And so, before COVID times, if you're new to the Learn to Hunt program, we host in-person workshops, and we always try to share a wild game dish during lunchtime that people can kind of snack on and share and talk about and discuss. And this was by far probably one of the best receptions we've had for some of our wild game dishes. We had so many people email us and ask us for this specific recipe because oftentimes if you've had goose and you've had goose cooked in a way that's not kind of pleasant, it can turn you off of waterfowl for a long time. And this is one of those recipes that's real easy, it's real foolproof, and has a great flavor and a great return on your time.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dan. So we're going to do another straightforward recipe here for a goose. So we're going to talk about BBQ Pulled Goose. This is another way that you can introduce people to your goose without it being overwhelming. It's basically a vector for barbecue sauce, like any other pulled recipe is, because that's the best. So we're going to start off with 2 pounds of goose. Basically, a nice sized goose, you get 1 pound per breast. So 2 breasts of a goose. You can put that in your crock pot. And we have 2 tablespoons butter, onion, cloves, garlic, Worcestershire sauce, and then some chicken stock. Again, I didn't have any of the homemade stock available, so we went with chicken stock on this one. And then your choice of barbecue sauce. So first, before you put your goose in your crock pot, you want to brown it on both sides. So you don't have to cook it all the way through. You just need to brown it so that way it has a sear. And then you can transfer that to your slow cooker. Then you want to add in all those other ingredients. So the onion, the garlic, Worcestershire sauce, and everything else. And then add the broth until it covers the breast in the crock pot. And then you leave that to simmer on low heat for 6 to 8 hours until the meat is easily shredded. You remove your meat from the liquid, and then you can shred that. And then you can discard of the liquid, and then you can add your meat back into the crock pot, and then you would add your sauce to it, and then you would warm that up so that way it would be ready for serving. Then you plate it with a bun. And you can also add, just like Dan's deer recipe, I think it was, you can also add cheese to that as well. It's super easy, and it's a good way to get through some of your goose in a different way. And I don't know what Dan, I haven't had bad waterfowl yet. I've always had pretty good waterfowl. I know everybody eats wild game one way or another, and they think of all these reasons why it doesn't taste good. But I haven't ran across it yet. And if you're afraid of it, I'd say order it at a restaurant. It doesn't even have to be like a white tablecloth restaurant either. I know some good Thai restaurants that have wonderful duck. So check that out. So that concludes our webinar for today. I hope you found some recipes you're thinking about using. I know I'm going to be using some of those. Poppers look freaking great. But some upcoming webinars. So we had our St. Patrick's Day lunch special today. So next week we have our woody plant ID and going over some woody plants.
Just to correct you, not next week, tomorrow. Sorry.
Tomorrow. Geez, that is tomorrow. Wow. All right. Thank you, Dan. All right. So March 18th, 7 p.m. Woody plant ID. Register for that as you registered for this. And we'll go over some IDs and some useful knowledge for hunters that know how to identify some plants, especially now if you're out scouting or looking around some areas and you don't have the leaves to look at. You can use some of our ID techniques, just looking at the bark and such, to help you see what's around your neck of the woods. Then we're going to do turkey calling, and that's going to be on March 23rd at 7 p.m. Then we're going to do archery equipment overview on March 25th. And then to close out March, we're going to do deer hunting 101. And it is a little early for deer season, but this is the time of year for all the applications for the lottery, for gun season at least. So we're talking about now to get everybody ready who should be thinking ahead for deer season in the fall. You can follow us for any other additional information as we come out with our April schedule on Facebook and our Instagram. And again, our YouTube channel is going to be growing. We're having interviews and instructional videos, as well as our recordings from our webinars are going to be on our YouTube channel. So subscribe to that to get any updates as we upload videos to there. With that, we thank you all for joining us today during this lunch hour. It looks like we pinned it right at 2 o'clock. Good job, guys. And If you have any questions or anything, let us know. If you think of anything between now and our next webinar and you have any questions about anything hunting in Illinois, be sure to email us or message us on Facebook and we will get back to you. $1:00, not 2:00. Thanks, Curtis. I got All right. If you have no questions, we appreciate you guys coming today and we'll see you all next time.